Rome, 83 CE. Under the roar of 50,000 throats in a stone amphitheater where the sun cut the air like a blade, a procession ended not with a triumph, but with a protocol so codified that centuries of silence nearly hid it. The account that follows rests on a chronicle fragment attributed to a provincial scribe, a Capitoline archive entry cited by a later senator, and an archaeological report that surfaced after excavations in the arena substructures that uncovered tags and chained fittings consistent with the registries described in the archives. If you have ever wondered what happened after the victor turned and raised his hand, like this video and subscribe, because what comes next will change how you think about spectacle and law. The air smelled of dust, oil, and roasted meat. The sands underfoot rasped against leather and metal. Voices rose in a dry metallic cadence. The heat made the stones smell of old sweat. There was always the metallic taste at the back of the mouth after a long day of clamor. At the center of this story is Livia, 22, from a salt town on the Tiber. She had lost her brother in a land dispute months earlier and been taken as a captive during the sweep that followed. She was not anonymous. She was a person shaped by loss and by work hauling nets on the river, and by a quiet habit of counting knots to keep herself steady. The choice she faced was not posed in law books at the time. It was formatted in the theater through ritual and inventory and the bureaucratic language of prizes and allocations. To understand how a public triumph translated into private ruin, we must first map the architecture and the officials that turned bodies into entries in a ledger. The amphitheater had a hypogeum, a hidden chambered undercroft of stone and timber with drainage channels and rails for pulleys where animals and prisoners were stored out of sight. A lanista named Maro managed the gladiators and kept receipts and tags for prisoners he presented as spoils. A centurion called Varus oversaw the official pageant on behalf of the local magistrate, Decimus, a senator who prized the spectacle as proof of his competence. Lucilla, a matron of the crowd, kept a ledger of days and seats and later testified in a petition fragment that was preserved among municipal correspondence. The political climate was brittle. The emperor sought allegiance through public shows, and magistrates answered with ever more elaborate ceremonies. Statistics in the archives show an uptick in allocations of captives for spectacles in years when grain supplies were tight and public morale needed boosting. The architecture reinforced that choice. The hypogeum was not random. It had chambers built to isolate, to display, and to transmit the management of bodies from public applause to private procedure. Months before the central incident, Livia had been catalogued in a register kept by Quintus, the record keeper, who stamped small clay tags with serial numbers and attached them to captives like inventory. The capture was ritualized. The men who took her read names and appended notes to indicate origin, status, and alleged offenses. Among the secondary actors who populate this account are Marcus, the champion, a man of unpredictable kindness; Publius, a tavern regular who bet on outcomes; Cassia, a washerwoman who watched everything from the gate; Aurelia, an archaeologist who later unraveled the tags and matched them to ledger entries; and Gaius, a scribe in the municipal office who altered a line in a record on the day after the spectacle. Each of these people performs a specific move in the narrative. Some supply testimony, some supply motive, some supply silence. The capture and transfer were bespoke acts of power. They took place at dawn with the smell of river salt and the clamor of carts. Men with rough hands shoved Livia into a cart. The rope burned into her wrists. The cloth under the rope was damp with dew. Voices talked in the narrow language of supply and demand, and the ropes clacked against wood. In the municipal account, there is a notation that reads, "Allocation of captive tomorrow," with a scratched margin that suggests later amendment. That word allocation surfaces repeatedly in bureaucratic records and in the inventory lists recovered in the excavation as tags pressed into clay bearing numbers corresponding to the ledger. The hypogeum imagery is stark. The air there tasted of mildew and iron. The stones were smooth from centuries of hands, and the pulleys made a soft creak that sounded like breath. People named in the files reacted in small but meaningful ways. Cassia shook her head and refused a ticket to the arena. Publius muttered that it was politics at play. Lucilla later crossed out a line in her notebook in a different ink. The spectacle itself was a theater of domination and of coded exchange. The crowd chanted the ritualized phrases that marked death, acquittal, and prize. The champion Marcus walked with laurels in his hair. He was called the Great of the East by the Lanista Maro, and his fame had weight in the city. From the mezzanine came the metallic clink of bracelets, and the smell of perfumed oil used by elites to mask the aroma of the crowd below. A line of captives was brought forward, not in the hope of justice, but as an instrument of spectacle. Voices in the crowd changed tone as the prize was announced. They called for more than execution. They called for demonstration. From the stands, a man shouted, "Decimus has given us a show that will not be forgotten." Another voice said, "This is a lesson to those who resist." The scene had 5 named onlookers reacting in ways that matter to the record. Publius cheered loudly. Lucilla sobbed quietly. Maro clapped once with a thin smile. Cassia spat into the sand, and Gaius struggled to write what he was seeing into his notes. The ritual at the center was not simply a reward. It was a transfer of ownership and a legal move. The champion could claim a prize, and the state could transform that claim into a sanctioned procedure. After the applause, the captives were taken to a chamber below where the mechanisms of treatment were already in place. The underground chamber had rails for cages, tags on the walls, and niches used to store items assigned to prisoners. The archaeological report details grooves in the floor and iron fittings that match the tags recovered, and small brass labels with numbers that correspond to ledger entries. There was a procedure, a bureaucratic script, beginning of day inventory check, tag placement, notation of witness names, transfer of custody. The record shows that on the day in question, a line was added that read, "Transferred to champion," with ambiguous shorthand. It is in this hidden machinery that the core ethical rupture occurred, a place where public theater met private decision-making. The chamber smelled of oil, damp, and iron. The stones held a long, cool dampness that clung to skin and voice. The lights were torches that threw their shadows long across faces. The sound of a pulley echoed like a small mechanical throat. Inside that chamber, there was an intimate conversation that would decide Livia's fate. The backstory that led her to this moment was long and cumulative. Born to a fisherman, she learned the names of currents before she learned to read. She watched her brother taken by a magistrate who claimed tax debt 2 winters earlier, and since then she had kept her anger folded into work. She had friends who traded notes about magistrates, and she had once spoken out at a market against a landlord and been marked for it. She had a quiet humor that surfaced in small acts, like giving away a piece of bread to a child. And she kept a loop of blue thread tied to her wrist because it was her sister's last gift. All of that mattered because she was not a cipher. She was a life that bureaucrats converted into an entry. The backstory matters in full because it is what made her choice possible, and because it shows that what the law treats as anonymous is always human. The backstory is a ledger of losses and small resistances, a map of the reasons why someone might refuse to perform the role assigned to them. The craft of the captain in the hypogeum, the rituals of indexing, the tags, the way men like Quintus and Gaius wrote entries, all meet in this human history and force a different question about responsibility. The conversation in the chamber is the emotional core. There are 8 exchanges in that scene to show how agency and ritual collided. Marcus, the champion, leaned against a stone pillar and said, "What do you want from me?" Livia replied, "I do not want words. I want the chance," Marcus said. "The code says a prize is a prize," Livia said. "A prize for you is a sentence for me," Marcus said. "I cannot deny what the Lanista orders." Livia said. "You can refuse. You can spare me." Marcus said. "If I spare you, Maro will take my wins away." Livia said. "Is a win worth selling your hands for?" Marcus said. "The crowd will not forgive weakness." Livia said. "And who will forgive you for silence?" Marcus said. "It is not that simple." Livia said. Nothing for a long moment, and then she asked, "Will you choose? Name your choice now." Marcus said, "I do not know how to be anything but what the arena taught me." Livia said, "Then learn to be more." The final seconds stretched. The torch flame was a thin, hungry tongue, and the pulleys creaked like memory. Each exchange carried weight. The words were clipped, the silences long. The chamber smelled of iron and oil, sweat, and something like old bread. The stone was cold under the champion palm, and the rope on Livia's wrist had left a white mark. The dialogue is not theatrical flourish. It is the record of a moral break being pulled. The tension that follows is 2 moments, each built to exacting length and consequence. First, the procedural tension as men debated in the hypogeum about the ledger. This debate lasted like a slow argument over a page of the register. Cumulus of voices rose and fell. The record-keeper Quintus refused to stamp a transfer without a witness. Maro insisted that the Lanista authority was binding. Varus cited the magistrate's order. Decimus, a presence even if not in the room, hovered in their language. And Gaius, the scribe, contemplated erasing an entry. That procedural tension is recorded in a fragment that shows hesitation in ink, numbers crossed, and a marginal note that reads, "Consult Decimus." The second moment of high tension is the public ripple when Marcus made his choice, and the result was broadcast not by proclamation, but by the rearrangement of entries. Gaius returned to the stands and sat for a long time. Publius, who had cheered, now would not meet Marcus' eyes. Lucilla rose and left her seat, and Cassia laughed softly. The city had been watching a ritual, but what it saw altered the ledger of reputation, and the municipal archive would bear witness in scribal corrections and in a petition that challenged the magistrate's authority. The aftermath moved from hypogeum technicalities to an institutional debate that reached the Senate floor. Documents and letters made their way to Decimus. His staff prepared a short report, arguing that the process had been within custom, but noted anomalies. The senator used the word disturbance in his notes, while progressive voices in the council cited the Capitoline archive fragment and the archaeological tags as physical proof of a premeditated system of transfer. Scholars, centuries later, would point to the tags, the brass labels, and the grooves as material evidence of a pipeline that made captives fungible, and to the marginalia in the municipal archive as the bureaucratic mechanism that enabled atrocity. In council, 2 factions emerged, one led by a conservative named Seneca, who argued that spectacle preserved social order. Another led by a quieter voice, Lucius, who demanded clarity and oversight. The debate, recorded in a public ledger, resulted in an ambiguous decree, a lex that limited certain public displays but left open the subterranean procedures that had enabled the transfer of captives into private hands. The language of that decree matters because it shows how institutions prefer regulation that preserves performance over reform that upends profit. 1 month later, a small report appears in municipal correspondence. Livia name does not appear in the public record, but petitions from citizens mention a spared captive whose testimony was sought. Archaeologist Aurelia published initial notes tying the numbered tags to entries in Quintus' ledger, and the public began to cross-reference what was in the stone with what was in the pen.
Social reactions were mixed. Publius, who had cheered, issued a public apology in a letter he said he had been swept by excitement. Decimus welcomed the cool of the margin and treated the outcome as a administered risk. The practical change was limited. Some lanista practices were softened. There were new notations required in inventories, but the hypogeum grooves remained the same. The 1-month mark is small in legal terms, but it is where memory meets documentation. 3 months later, the petition reached a minor court. A report circulated that referenced the Capitoline fragment, and an attested testimony from Lucilla, who had crossed lines in her notebook and later filled in the marginalia. The court considered adding stricter oversight for allocations, but the lex in the Senate had left gaps. Marcus received a formal reprimand and his standing was reduced, though he kept his laurels in private, despite public shame. The urban poor gathered in small clusters to retell the story as a symbol of both resistance and limitation. The narrative was now split between those who saw a single act of mercy and those who saw a structural fault that persisted. The archaeological community published an expanded report with photographs of tags and brass labels, plus a dating analysis suggesting the fittings were contemporary to the events. Scholars used C14 on associated organic materials to bracket the construction of the grooves and confirmed a chronology that matched municipal entries. The 3-month mark made the case more complex because it combined legal debate with material proof. 6 months later, the outcome settled into a pattern that revealed the hardest truth. A formal lex had been produced that limited certain public claims of allocation. It ordered registration of transfers and mandated witness signatures. But loopholes remained, and practices continued in less visible forms. Gaius, the scribe, had been reassigned to a distant clerkship.
Quintus, the record-keeper, retired suddenly. His ledgers ended with a thin note that some pages were forwarded to a prefectural archive. Aurelia, the archaeologist, published a monograph that tied the physical tags to the social practice and urged a re-examination of the way archives and architecture interact. The city enacted cosmetic reforms, and the hypogeum was repaired and its fittings moved, but the social mechanisms that turned people into entries persisted in other forms. For survivors like Livia, the change was uneven. Some found work in distant towns, others disappeared into private servitude. The 6-month reflection ends with both modest legal adjustments and a stark reminder that architecture and bureaucracy together can normalize cruelty, even when the law speaks otherwise. In the end, the story is not simply about one champion or one captive. It is about how the amphitheater, the hypogeum, and the ledger conspired to make certain people legible only as prizes, and how a single moral choice by a man named Marcus cracked that script enough to force debate. The consequence, institutional and symbolic, was real. A lex was debated, an archive kept corroded entries, and archaeologists found material proof. But the deeper question remains, and it is the oldest question of society: what defines civilization? The monuments or the corridors where people vanish into files? If this account unsettled you, subscribe, because we keep digging for the documents and the marks in the stone that historians and archaeologists use to hold institutions to account. Share this with someone who cares about how power is performed and how small acts can force a ledger to be written differently. Because at the edge of every triumph, there is the choice to remember or to record nothing, and sometimes the most enduring monument is the one that names those who were almost erased.